I bring word, sire. They are said to be gathering their forces, as are your allies. It appears it will be civil war after all, despite the Darkspawn. Pity.
There was a lot of writing that went into Dragon Age. I mean, in excess of 800,000 lines of dialogue.
You must deal with the repercussions of his deeds before you can face the archdemon. Unless it finds you first.
How do you never stumble? You're great.
And now you did it.
We had the possibility of sitting down with these actors and talking to them about this is who their character is, this is the arc that their character goes through.
So this line 148, I just need you to pull it back in your mind, like go back to when you lost everything.
I guess that if you have a rep for making evil characters interesting, people come back to you. And the other, of course, good thing is that they tend to be the best written.
As a writer, you get an idea in your head of what a character is supposed to sound like. And when there's an experienced voiceover actor, you get something back that is actually better.
The opportunities are limitless, really. And that's what fascinates me about it. And the opportunities for the gamer within the game are limitless. So if you engage in this game, and you might recognize my voice, I hope it will seduce you into getting further and further embroiled into my dark, dark world, until I eventually meet my fate.
One of the great things about working on Dragon Age is that the development team has really challenged itself to bring something new to the fantasy genre. It's a genre that's so saturated that we really have been pushing ourselves to stand out, to bring something fresh and unique, and I really enjoy that process.
Ferelden itself is actually kind of almost a barbaric nation, not too far away from being really uncivilized.
It's a land that was occupied by the Empire of Orlais, which is its neighbor, for a generation until it finally broke free. And all of a sudden, the blight begins. So suddenly this nation that's just starting to get its feet now has to deal with a crisis that threatens to destroy it.
We're not telling a story with words alone in Dragon Age Origins. What's in the levels actually tell you a visual story and also an archaeological story as you're going through the game.
Villages and cities that have existed for hundreds of years, but they've gone through multiple iterations of war and rebuilding, so you have all these layers built on top of one another.
They'll tell of the ancient Fereldans. They'll tell of the strife with the Tevinter Empire long ago. They'll tell of the great, wondrous battles that have taken place, and you're just now walking through the sort of the ashes of these great conflicts.
We definitely pulled a lot of historical architectural reference.
We were trying to make something to where you could imagine people working, living, breathing in these spaces.
The dwarves, which are very Aztecian, Mayan influenced, very angular shapes. You have the humans, some of the Anglo-Saxon 1200 AD influences.
You know, lots of timber, lots of like rough stone. It definitely makes it feel like it's kind of almost like the frontier of a fantasy nation. The first step that you have to take in creating levels is coming up with your core concept. Every inch of a level is an opportunity for us to engage you in combat, to tell a story, or to take your breath away. For example, one of the most visually stunning places that we have is the Urn of Sacred Ashes, an ancient place built kind of at the early days of the church. We always wanted to have a very striking entrance, which gives you a sense of age and history and grandeur. You would go through and figure out what happens in every individual room, so people would have a map of what to do for the art level creation side, and also for later on for you when you're actually bringing it to life with creatures and combat.
So one of the huge advantages we had on Dragon Age Origins was the fact that we were able to do a lot of early development in the Neverwinter Nights engine.
This is the Urn of Sacred Ashes, the way that we built it in the Neverwinter prototype. We wanted to make sure that the gameplay, the story, and all the design elements really worked and fit together. And now we'll show you what it looks like in the final game. And as you're about to see, this is the same entrance in the Dragon Age engine.
That whole process can take, on a small level or a simple level, could take a week, where some of the more complex ones can take months and months and months. You know, that's a huge undertaking.
Ferelden is just one country on the main continent in Dragon Age universe, so there's certainly a lot more to explore and talk about in the future.
When you think of fantasy, you may think of majestic, beautiful creatures, but in Dragon Age is truly a dark, evil, and twisted world, so our intent was to turn these creatures into walking nightmares.
The concept artists really had to pull out the horror and really work with evil, paint the face of evil.
The mages had sought to usurp heaven, but instead, they destroyed it. They were cast out, twisted and cursed by their own corruption. They returned as monsters, the first of the Darkspawn.
As a concept artist, we really have two jobs. One is to build the blueprints and lay the foundation in order to actually build the things that go into creating a world. The second is to inspire the team, to create the images that really get everyone pumped up. On Dragon Age, the level of detail in each concept is staggering. Each one is a piece of art unto itself. One great example is the work of Sung Kim. The level of love he puts into this stuff is impressive. One of the best creatures for me is from the Darkspawn. It's the Hurlock. He's got that horrifying grin, permanent grin on his face with big pointy teeth. It looks like you can tell it was once a man, and that's what makes it so terrifying, is the fact that you can almost tell that its descendants were like us and that he's just been suffering for millennia. We really want to create a sense of like immediate terror, but then almost I think there's a sense of sympathy too, how you can almost tell that we could become this if we'd made the wrong choices.
There's over 30 races of monsters and demons. The Dragon Age art team has been working hard on these characters for several years.
There's a lot of different people and a lot of different departments that actually work on one character. It'll go from design into concepting.
Because it's very time-consuming to make it, we have to make sure we get it right on paper first, and important creatures may receive half a dozen iterations before we commit to building it.
From there, we had to figure out how to bring that piece to life from a technical standpoint. There's modeling, texturing, and rigging, and then it finally falls into the hands of the animators.
We'll work very closely with the animation team to make sure that the model's working correctly. Then we'll make sure that it gets into the designer's hands again so it can be implemented into the game and used correctly. The job of a character artist is to take the concepts and interpret it into 3D models for the world. My personal favorite creature that I got to work on Dragon Age Origins was the Darkspawn Ogre.
We tried to make the ogre so terrifying in his appearance that the player wouldn't believe that he could actually beat it in combat.
I was really looking forward to it. The concept was very unique, and it was a bit of a challenge to actually bring it into the 3D environment with the different elements.
It might seem like a strange thing to say when working on a fantasy game, but realism is a very important part of this process. If you don't believe that they're real, then none of it affects you. It's nothing.
I mean, the level of detail on these creatures is amazing. I mean, you can zoom right into any part of them from any angle, and they look absolutely fabulous.
So here we have the Pride Demon. It's one of the largest creatures in the game. From this concept, we'll make a 3D concept out of it. Once we do that, we'll take this basic mesh and we'll go ahead and paint a really detailed, sculpted model. We'll take this and we'll make a projection so we can get all these little details into a texture and then place that texture onto the mesh that you saw before, and you'll get your finished model with all its texture and glory.
Making a creature scary is more than just making it big. It's really the way the creature moves that indicates its strength, its mass, and its bulk. Animation is really about performance, and the same way that an actor gets prepared for a role in learning and studying what this character thinks, what this character feels, the animator is, it's his job to bring that to the character in a more digital form. The great thing about working on Dragon Age is that the animators have the ability to start bringing not only humanoid characters to life, but also larger characters, more interesting, dynamic characters like dragons and ogres and the undead. So this is what the ogre puppet looks like once the rigging and the modelers have finished working with it, and now the animators can take it and start making it move.
Sometimes we would just act it out, like get up and physically act out how like an ogre would move.
As you can see, when the ogre hits the ground, his entire body shakes from the massive impact of his size, and that's a really nice detail.
See the ogre finally in the game and working and animating and all its terrifying glory is actually it's quite surreal.
When you're working with such a big creative team, everyone is coming to the table with their own style, with their own techniques. And as the development process goes along and you start building a world together, it becomes one language. And that language becomes something like Dragon Age Origins.
When we set down to design the combat system for Origins, I think we were trying to modernize a classic. Baldur's Gate 2 has always been a reference point for us as the game that really let you feel like you were mixing classes, abilities, combinations, smart planning, and on-the-moment thinking. So we decided to modernize that. Realistic combat fighting styles, like actually, you know, the weight of the sword, the presence of a maul smashing into a body, all of these things are really key for us. And I think what we resulted in is something you just have to think of as like sword porn. It's for the enthusiast. In terms of looking at source material, I think you have to look at classics. You know, the Lord of the Rings, 300, and certainly, you know, even some of the older stuff. Go back to the really best fight scenes you'd find in the Conan movies even. This is a brutal time to be in, and we wanted to evoke that feeling. What we wanted to achieve was the sense that you could be both the general, lieutenant, that kind of commander role, as well as the guy just leading the charge. So we've put together several systems, including a tactics system that lets you fully control the AI of your characters, and of course just smart reactions to the way the enemies occur. So you kind of have that moment where you plan. You see the enemy, you're thinking like, how do I enact this grand strategy to make these characters do as much friggin' damage as I can? And then once you charge in there, the battle's just a swirling melee. You've got positioning, moving your rogues around behind so they're just jamming their swords into kidneys. You have your warriors just holding that line, and your mages kind of holding the back line, just raining death upon your foes. So it's very in your face once you're engaged, but you always have that little moment just before where you go, oh, I know what's coming, and here's my plan. Often what you want to do is deal with the strategic impact of the equipment and the talents that you've chosen. So you want to try and mix your characters for maximum effectiveness. All characters have a sense of whether they're being flanked or whether the character's directly behind them. There's direct bonuses to everyone who's making attacks from those kind of harder to defend arcs. Even the sense of, you know, what weapon, what side are you using can affect things like sweeping attacks when you're swinging double weapons. You can certainly use barricades, walls, things like that to block incoming enemy fire, so you can actually make advances carefully under cover. And then things like elevation really do play into the mechanics as well. Even what you wear affects the tactics you're going to employ in Dragon Age Origins. The heaviest armors in the game are going to protect you, but at the same time, they're going to slow you down. You're going to be fatigued just by wearing them, so you won't be able to pull off as many special moves. Finishing moves are the way that we've managed to basically imply that the combat has a momentum. Finishing move is this awesome visceral moment where it's, you know, sword through the chest, boom, off comes his head. You know, smashing a guy with a maul so he goes spinning through the air and lands in front of you. Or possibly killing a really large creature by actually climbing on top of it and jamming your blade in.
We had some stunt actors from the movie 300, like doing some cool swings, cool death blow moves.
And it's not just about flash. As you wear your opponents down, the game is dynamically adjusting the incidence of these happening. We're essentially rewarding your combat dominance. As your opponents are worn down, their morale's starting to break, and you are just crushing them on the battlefield, you'll notice that your characters are finishing them with far more frequency. More heads come off, more chests are pierced. It's pretty fantastic. Designing combat isn't just about, you know, rules and a couple of animations. It's about the entire experience as far as I'm concerned. When a player comes out of a combat, what I really want is that sense of tension and then that release of, man, look at what I just pulled off, that sense of orchestrating something. I don't want to make a game that just softballs and you're like, oh yeah, I killed that guy again. No, I want you to feel challenged and like you were rewarded for playing smart. For me, one of the most exciting parts, I think, will be the war stories. You know, the forum posts, the water coolers. People even on the team are already discussing ways they dealt with boss X. And that's pretty cool and very, very, very rewarding because it feels like the game was one that they played and it was for them.
Dragon Age is a big game. And while that's a great value for the consumer, it's a giant pain in the ass.
There was a lot of long nights, there's a lot of hard crunch, but I mean, when you're working on something that you love, you don't really mind so much.
Working with our team was awesome. I mean, everybody put in 110%.
It was big. At our peak, we were around 150 people, but we really came together as a team. And it doesn't really matter anymore if you're a programmer or you're an artist. It just matters that you want to make the best thing possible.
I think one of the greatest challenges was understanding that our audience has grown up. The industry as a whole is older. It's not this thing relegated to kids anymore. And understanding that what we almost had was a mandate to make sure that the game had punch.
In some ways, we felt like we were out to prove ourselves as not only a team, but as a company again. And I don't know, that was something that was very exciting.
Dragon Age is a funny game in some respects because it's something that you're not going to understand the breadth of it and the scope of the world until you sit down and you actually find yourself in the middle of it, and then you'll be like, wow, there's so much here.
Dragon Age is a universe that has a story that spans thousands of years. Dragon Age Origins takes place over maybe a year, maybe 2 years at most, depending on how exactly you're playing it. So as you can imagine, there's hundreds and hundreds of additional stories to tell in this same space. And I think you're going to see a lot more coming from us soon.
Dragon Age is about dominating the battlefield. It's about that moment when you charge, that tension of not being certain, and then seeing your characters slice heads off, throw spells, set things on fire, until essentially you bring it to a crashing close and say, yeah, this one I won, now I've got 400,000 more to go.
Dragon Age is really a return to the thing that brought me to BioWare in the first place. When I started at BioWare back in Baldur's Gate 1 days, we were making the pinnacle of fantasy gaming, and I think we've really come back to that with Dragon Age Origins. What we've done is we've taken the best of high fantasy and the best of darker, lower fantasy and combined them into one game. So you're taking, like the Tolkien, the overarching good versus evil metaphor that draws you through a high fantasy game, but the darker, grayer choice and consequence of something like a George R.R. Martin or a Conan, and we combine them. So you're playing as a Grey Warden, you have to save the world, but the way you do that sometimes means you have to make some pretty tough choices.
I think with Origins, what we managed to hit is a note of the familiar and yet the uncanny. It's certainly a game that's going to have elves with pointy ears. Yeah, we're not going to change the dwarves. Many of them do have beards, for sure. But within those expectations, we understand them well enough ourselves that we've managed to break a lot of them and say, you know, sure, the elves do have pointy ears, but they're also, up until recently, enslaved and live in ghettos in the city. This kind of puts you in a place where you know what you're dealing with an elf, but you don't know what you're dealing with when it comes to Dragon Age. It's a different setting for the familiar to occur, and it will surprise you.
It's very, very complicated and intricate. And I mean, this game not only looks realistic, in a way, the story also is quite realistic.
You would attempt to put a puppet on the throne, and every soul here knows it. The better question is who will pull the strings.
So this is a world already with a lot of conflict going on, and now when we start off Dragon Age Origins, a blight, these darkspawn rising back from under the ground are coming to consume the earth once again, and this is what you're fighting against.
Farewell, Mother. Do not forget the stew on the fire. I would hate to return to a burned-down hut.
Bah! 'Tis far more likely you will return to see this entire area, along with my hut, swallowed up by the blight.
All I meant was...
Yes, I know.
The characters in the game aren't two-dimensional. The way that a player interacts with them is going to change who they become.
They have their own motivations and their own desires and their own hopes and dreams.
You're going to have party members talking to each other, they're bantering.
Having Morgan and Wynne in your party at the same time, because they're both mages but coming from very different schools of thought on magic, there's going to be a lot of bickering, a lot of different discussion on the way magic works just by having those two people in your party.
They're reacting to everything that you do. You'll take an action in the world, and a party member will speak up, and perhaps they'll object, perhaps they'll approve, and you may change your course of action based on that, or suffer the consequences, right? The consequences are what the game is all about.
It's like dancing on a field of razor blades, so it may be possible to make it through Dragon Age Origins with everyone happy, but you're going to have to be really careful about what you're doing.
There was a lot of writing that went into Dragon Age.
It appears it will be civil war after all, despite the Darkspawn. Pity.
When people talk about the world in the game, it's with the idea that there's more than what they're talking about, and I think that comes across to the player, right?
No one has a place here. Your farmers wish to be merchants. The merchants dream of being nobles, and the nobles become warriors. No one is content to be who they are.
When I play games, you can tell very quickly, usually, if what is present is all that's been created. And then there's other times when you're reading a book or when you're playing a game, and you can sort of feel immediately that there's this whole breadth of history that the game creator is just dying to get you to fall in love with. And that's what I'm hoping, that the fans will get into this world and they will fall in love with it and see exactly what we've put together for them and value it.
The sound design of Dragon Age is about creating the immersion in a world of dark fantasy. Dragon Age is probably the biggest game I've ever worked on and is about the size of 3 of the biggest games that I've ever worked on combined. Mythical creatures are probably one of the most challenging things to do in sound design.
We have a breakdown of the Deep Stalker, a couple of different samples used, one of which is a human imitating a cat. The cat itself, a lizard, and lastly we have a dolphin. Let's mix them together, you get this.
I think you'll find that the audio experience of the cinematics is on par with what you would experience in a movie. You have a huge full-scale battle, enormous changes in perspective. You have very strong emotional undertones to the whole scene, so you're moving between telling the story from an emotional perspective and telling it from an action perspective.
Warriors and mages, barbarians and kings. Grey Warden sacrificed everything to stem the tide of darkness and prevail.
So the making of Dragon Age audio was a team collaborative effort. 10 guys putting everything they've got into bringing that fantasy to life. They pulled off what was really a massive task. It sounds way better than I anticipated it would sound. The sound design of Dragon Age is about creating the immersion in a world of dark fantasy.
The darkness of this game really is being enhanced by the music, and the music really goes beyond dark.
They returned as monsters, the first of the Darkspawn.
We actually have the Seattle Northwest Sinfonia play all the music for us.
The score is epic in both its grandeur and orchestration. It's also epic in the amount of music that we had to compose.
I think I've composed about 6 to 7 specific themes, but I also had to make sure that the score is cohesive enough. I took what we call the main theme and then I'm weaving it underneath all the time. If not the actual melody, I'm doing the harmony. If not the harmony, some elements from the rhythm. But you could always hear some elements from the Grey Warden's world.
I'd be going back to review scenes that I previously had the temp music in, and a scene would go from being maybe flat or comic to really engaging me.
I think that actually what I really enjoyed to work on this game was actually the songwriting.
Simon, I believe, called Anon up and said, you know, here is a set of lyrics that the writing team has come up with. You know, why don't you and Aubrey collaborate on something? The very next morning, Anon called me up and said, I have something, come over and record it. And I said, okay. And I came over and I really connected with it right off the bat. And we sewed it up, you know, and sent it over within 24 hours.
She has a great melodic sense, and many times she will just, you know, sing almost exactly what I wrote, but then she will make this little change.
I think it's probably one of Enon's best scores. It's certainly the best score that I've worked on.
Simon Pressey, I mean, he basically was guiding me from one hand, letting me fly, but from the other hand, really directing my flight path. And I'm dedicating this score for you, the gamer. I know that you guys are just avid, most of you, and I could understand why, because, you know, in many years I was this way, and I think that you're about to engulf into an amazing adventure, and I just envy you because this is going to be your first time, and I already know what's going on.